Hi everyone, it's 5:30, so I'll just start off with a bit of an introduction while we're sort of waiting for a few other people to come online. Welcome, thank you for tuning in tonight. My name's Julie Stratford. I'm the president of the Friends of Coburg Cemetery. We are a small volunteer community group who basically focused on Little Coburg Cemetery on Bell Street in Preston. I'm coming to you tonight from the inner north, but not the cemetery, which is my usual backdrop for presenting and talking about the people who are buried there. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the cemetery and where I am right now is Wurundjeri land. In the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people are the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of this area that's now known as Moreland and Darebin, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all First Nations communities who significantly contribute to the life and the community of the area. So thank you to the Wurundjeri people for allowing me to be here. And I was talking about the Friends of Coburg Cemetery. We're basically focused on a very small spot of that Wurundjeri land, 6 hectares on Bell Street in Preston. Even though it's called Coburg Cemetery, it's Preston. So we run tours and we talk about the people and some of the events that have occurred, that the backdrop of the cemetery can help us to remember and give us a sense of place and a sense of who has walked on these paths before us. We talk about the different societal effects that have led people to the lives that they lead and the lives that they then finish and are then buried at Coburg Cemetery. We have a newsletter where we often write about people's stories. We do cleanups and we share information, and we can do grave searches. Some people who want to find out about Uncle Tom or great uncle Harry who's buried at the cemetery, they can send a note in to us, and we'll go looking for their grave for them and send a photo. But we're a very small group, and unfortunately the other members of the committee couldn't be here tonight. Lee Anthony is working very hard at in evenings at the moment, so I'm here on my own, but hopefully it won't be too challenging and your questions won't be too difficult. The cemetery, I think one of the things that's fascinating for us is it's not just about stories and the local history, but also about the current environment. It's a beautiful space. It has flowering gums, birds. We've got currawongs, as we all do at the moment, but kookaburras and lots of blue-tongued lizards and beautiful space, empty space without houses and mostly without people. And it's a beautiful spot to walk your dog or just to go for a walk. And we really enjoy holding tours and introducing people coming into the cemetery and running events that showcase the sculptures and the art and the angels and the monuments and the spaces generally. So I will encourage all of you to think about coming on a tour if you haven't already, when we can run them again. Today I've only got a short time to tell some of the stories that we might talk about on one of the tours, and to give you a little bit of the people stories that we have researched and found out. Remember too that we're an amateur group. We are not professional historians or presenters, and that we are just keen to encourage people to visit and appreciate and to really engage with that space on Bell Street, Preston, that is Coburg Cemetery. So interestingly, and not yet surprisingly, Coburg Cemetery has a disproportionate number of left-wing politicians and union leaders buried there. Some people were living their lives well miles and miles away from Coburg, but they bought a grave space in Coburg Cemetery. We have pioneering women writers, we've got sports stars, artists, performers, a few gangsters, soldiers, mostly Anzacs. We've got lots and lots of babies and children buried there, victims of shootings, of illness, of disaster, of crashes and drownings and accidents. And of course, often the stories that we tell are the salacious, exciting ones about shootings and disaster. But there are some fascinating, ordinary people buried there as well. One of the people I want to talk about first, because it's kind of one of the more cheerful, is a sports star that lots and lots of people have probably heard of, and strangely there's a lot of Collingwood football players buried at Coburg Cemetery, and a lot of you might have heard of Jock McHale. Jock McHale is buried there. He is one of Collingwood Football Club's most famous coaches, although he also had a 15-year playing career where he played 260 games, and 191 of those were played consecutively, and that was a record at the time. He was known for being a coach, and he coached Collingwood Football Club to 8 premierships. Susan Reid, thank you. It's your favourite team. I'm glad I can tell you that there's quite a few Collingwood players buried at Coburg. We're kind of thinking about doing a tour with a theme of sports stars at some point, and you'll find there's quite a few of the Collingwood gang there. There's the interesting thing about Jock McHale is that he coached the team to 8 premierships, but it was the final premiership that he saw that was in 1953. Their first premiership in 17 years was the last one that he watched, because a week after that premiership, he died of a heart attack. We've got a sign up on Jock McHale's grave, and he's marked in our cemetery tour map that you can pick up, a map at the rotunda at the cemetery if you're wandering around there, and walk around following the map, and you'll find Jock McHale is listed in that map if you want to go and have a look at his grave. There's also some amazing women. I mentioned some female writers, and Emily Skinner is that's an interesting question Leanne's just asked. Was Coburg a Collingwood Football Club catchment area? I'm not sure. Maybe it was. I'm not up with footy. Emily Skinner wrote a journal. Now, she may not have realised that one day it would be picked up by an academic and published publicly, and her personal writings would be read by all and sundry. But she wrote a fascinating insight into what it was like to be a woman in the 1850s on Victorian goldfields. Emily had come to Australia, quickly married her fiance, and moved up to the Victorian goldfields in the Ovens River area, and had kept a journal about the people and the loneliness and her experiences, and had written describing what was going on around her, but giving people pseudonyms so that there was no real she was able to hide some of the truth about who she was talking about, which meant that she could write quite frankly and openly about what she saw around her. So her book that's now, like I said, published, it's something that gives a voice to otherwise fairly silent and invisible community of miners' wives living on the goldfields in the 1850s in Victoria. She wrote about other miners' wives. She wrote about events around her and the people, the loneliness, the poverty, the hard housework, and she also wrote about things like the women who were miners' companions at the local dances, and she kept an element of ladylike respectability, but was also able to tell a little bit about what the real world for her was like. Fascinating stories. Another female writer that we've talked about on some of our tours. 20 years after Emily Skinner died, Ina Watson was born, and she was also working in a male-dominated field, and was actually working in radiology at a time that this was not a common world for women to work in. She was a mentor and supporter of young women entering the radiology field, and she was someone who spoke, lectured, and encouraged, but she's best known for her love of birds. She wrote children's books about birds, and she lectured and photographed and wrote articles for magazines and newspapers about birds. Her kids' books, there's one called Silvertail, and it's about a lyrebird that lived in the Dandenongs, and she was the first female president of the Field Naturalist Club. So this is a woman who was massively involved in natural history, and not surprisingly, her grave has a beautiful metal plaque with a carving of a lyrebird. Now, you can see by going and finding her grave at the Coburg Cemetery, or have a look at the video that Lee, one of the other committee members, and I made, and that my dear friend Robert Curtin edited for us. We've put a link to those videos that we made, where you can watch a couple of rain-bedraggled cemetery nerds wander around Coburg Cemetery and talk about some of the people, including Ina, and having a look at the lyrebird carving on her grave. The links to those videos, they're on the Moreland Library YouTube page, but there's a link on the notes page of this particular Facebook event. And if that's confusing, just put a note in the comments and I'll come back later and give you a link to those, so that you can watch, like I said, a couple of rain-bedraggled cemetery nerds wander around and show images of these graves. The other one of the other fascinating women, I mean, we do a tour that's about remarkable women generally buried at Coburg Cemetery, who I love that tour, because I think that gives such an amazing insight into some of the women who developed the inner northern suburbs of Melbourne and our community. They've helped form our community into what it is today. But Anna Brennan, Brennan's a name well known in legal circles, and Anna Brennan was the first female law graduate from Melbourne Uni in 1909. She is Frank and Thomas Brennan's sister. She did work as a barrister. She was a social reformer. She was an activist for women's rights at a time when the legal system was pitched against women, and in particular married women, at a time that very few voices were heard within the legal system that were supporting of women's rights. And Anna Brennan, definitely part of a very important Catholic, legal and political family. She lived with her siblings in Parkville for a long time. Some people may have heard of Frank Brennan. I think some of his I think his legal company still actually runs in the city. And Brennan Park Pool up in Bendigo is named after the same family because that's where they originated. And Anna was even at in her 80s, still amazing. She was on her way to, at 83, she was on her way to a lecture about nuclear fission in 1962 when she slipped on the stairs in Melbourne Uni, and 2 days later she died. So I think the fact that she was still expanding her world shows an amazing academic in a world that was definitely male dominated. So she's another person. We've got a sign up, posted up on her grave, so that you can read a little bit about her when you visit her grave. It's on the map. So while we're talking about lawyers, I thought I'd mention someone a bit more modern who some of you will probably have heard of. Frank Costigan QC is buried at Coburg Cemetery. Frank Costigan, you may have, certainly people who were in Melbourne at the time in the 80s and 90s may have heard of. He headed up the Royal Commission into Anti-Corruption. He looked at how various criminal forces had infiltrated the union movement, and he was basically exposing a whole lot of corruption that was occurring at the time in a whole lot of powerful hallways. There was the phrase "bottom of the harbour" scheme that came from his work, and some of you may recall that he had exposed that there was a prominent businessman in Melbourne who was very involved in a lot of activities that were coming before him, and that businessman was codenamed Goanna. And then the newspapers got hold of that one and exposed who Goanna was. It was Kerry Packer. And Kerry Packer hired a hot, young, smart lawyer and managed to fight these accusations. And that hot young lawyer at the time was 30-year-old Malcolm Turnbull. It's a fascinating story, and there's a lot more of that story that when we run tours that include Frank Costigan that we'll talk about. But lots of media attention, and like I said, a lot of you will have heard of Frank Costigan. So I think it's just quite fantastic that he's buried at Coburg. And then on the other side of the bench, so to speak, Coburg has a whole lot of gangsters buried in it, possibly because it was one of the open and available cemeteries at a time when some of those guys were dying. So one of the gangsters that got also a lot of media attention was Bunny Whiting. Bunny, he was called Bunny because he was a rabbitoh for a while in the teens and 20s, 100 and something years ago. He was basically, he sold rabbits, he sold pies, he boxed for money. But you know what? He was the younger brother of a major gangster, and then one of the leaders of one of the Coburg gangs. Sorry, not Coburg, Carlton gangs. He lived in Carlton, and he and his brother Ted Whiting were very involved in the Fitzroy vendetta and the activities of gangs around the Fitzroy and Carlton area at the time. And Bunny Whiting, he got himself in lots of trouble. He was known as the Pieman Slogger because he sold pies out the front of the boxing event, perhaps out the front of Festival Hall, then went in, boxed when it was his turn, came back out again afterwards and sold pies again. he was fairly resilient guy. He holds some sort of record for having done the most number of boxing matches. But Bunny Whiting is buried at Coburg Cemetery now with a lovely modern-ish, nicely fresh gravestone. And I think it's funny that the fact that he ended up in massive trouble, obviously, with the police for stabbing violently 7 times his wife's lover, and yet, strangely, I don't know, but this is true, every time we stand at his gravesite and present and talk about his life, there's this old knife that sits on his grave. It's moved a few times. Someone's picked it up and moved it, but it's still sitting on his grave. I was just there a couple of weekends ago. That knife is still sitting on Bunny Whiting's grave. I'm not kidding. It's not the oyster knife that he stabbed his wife's lover with, but it's just kind of funny and weird. I love that bit. Now, the other thing that I think, and the other gangster that I think some of you may have heard about is Snowy Cutmore. And Snowy, you might have heard about him because he was in one of the Underbelly TV series. Well, not Snowy himself, but his name. Snowy Cutmore killed Squizzy Taylor. Now, Squizzy is a lot more famous than Snowy and a lot more famous than Bunny Whiting, but they were all walking the same footpaths and all rubbing up against the same gangsters. Snowy Cutmore was a problem child. He was in trouble even when very, very young. And he killed Squizzy Taylor. He's the one. He is buried at Coburg Cemetery, and again, we've got a sign posted up against his grave so that you can read about it when you visit. The story is written in this fabulous article in one of the, I don't know, Google it, but an article written by Shane Maloney, one of our local crime authors, about the shootout that happened between Snowy and Squizzy. And Snowy was hit home with the flu. And when I say home, he was with his mum in Carlton, not far from, just down the road from Tankerville Arms, which is on the Fitzroy side. He was living in a small terrace house. Something, I don't remember the full story here and now, but I've got it written down. Squizzy and one of Squizzy's henchmen turned up, knocked on the door, and Mum came to the door, Snowy's mum, and oh, no, we couldn't let him in, they burst in, there was gunshot. Snowy, although sick with the flu, was lying in his bed with a gun under his pillow. There was a shootout. It was nasty. Both the key guys, Squizzy and Snowy, got shot, and even Mum scored a nick on her shoulder. And Squizzy left and got into a taxi on his way to St. Vincent's Hospital to get some help, but he'd left Snowy dead, and Squizzy died quickly after that. So massive, big drama, and one of those stories that there's newspaper clippings on Trove if you're looking to find out about Snowy Cutmore and Squizzy Taylor. It's a fascinating story. So, as you can tell, I kind of like the salacious stuff. It always gets the crowds in. I think too that there's some really interesting coppers who are buried at Coburg. We've got a Superintendent Brophy who was meeting in the dark late at night on a May cold evening at Royal Park up near the zoo. He was meeting one of his informants. He ended up taking 3 or 4 bullets and shot right through the neck, lived to tell the tale. There was a Royal Commission and Brophy, John O'Connell Brophy, was there was a lot of suspicion around what the hay was going on here because it was strange. All of the stories changed. The evidence was kind of lost. People didn't end up getting charged with those shootings. He lived to tell the tale. Another copper that got shot was David Mcgraw, and it's a sad story. He was one of the coppers that interrupted a robbery at Trades Hall at number 1 Lygon Street. And there's a great story that we tell that talks about David Mcgraw being one of the police that was shooting in the dark at these guys that had broken in and were stealing money from the safe room at Trades Hall. And he took a bullet and died. And the bullet holes, if you're next time you're at that amazingly beautiful building of Trades Hall, if you're going up the stairs, there are still bullet holes in the concrete works there. Have a look. Fascinating story. So I think just before I leave the whole shooting stories, there's another fascinating story. It's actually about someone who lived in Warburton, but strangely buried at Coburg. Saeed Shah was an imam. He was one of the leaders of the Muslim faith in 1911. He was shot by his landlord. His landlord and he had been having ongoing arguments. There had been broken windows. There'd been a pig's head left at a front door. There had been arguments. Eventually, it resulted in a shooting. And although the landlord said he aimed for his leg, I didn't know the gun was loaded, I didn't mean to kill him. Saeed Shah took a bullet to the stomach and ended up dying quite quickly, even though he got left sitting on a log in the bush while the family wandered away. And it's a really sad, amazing story, but in newspaper clippings that we've got that talk about these. Oh, I've got some newspaper clippings here to show you. There's some amazing stories that were told at the time about what had happened, whether it was self-defense, and perhaps they got the story a little bit wrong because they talked about him being a Hindu in one, a Muslim in another, a Mohammedan, as they called him at some of the newspaper articles. It was a very sad story, but had a real exposure of the racism in Australia at the time. And the landlord got off, by the way. So by picking up those pictures, I've just realised I've got some other pictures here that I didn't show you when I was talking about those gangsters. That's Bunny Whiting that I mentioned before. That's his mugshot, Bunny Whiting. And that's one of the signs at Snowy Cutmore's grave. As you can see, there's some clear signs. And here's the gorgeous mugshot of Bunny Whiting, of Snowy Cutmore, who looked like a lovely boy but was trouble on a stick. So again, another shooting. I promise it's my last one. William Angkatell is someone else who we talk about quite often on tours. And we talk about him in the video that I see the Moreland Library has posted links to those videos in the comments underneath this video. William Angkatell, believe it or not, he was the young bank clerk who was working in Denali, Victoria, when the largest gold nugget of ever, I think, was found and taken to the Denali bank for weighing and for a deposit, please. It's the Welcome Stranger. The Welcome Stranger gold nugget was found in Denali in, I've forgotten the date, sorry, I've got it written down, second half of the 1800s. And it was William Angkatell, who was the bank clerk, who received the nugget, weighed it, realised he didn't have enough money at the bank to pay for it, so gave a deposit. But more famously, later on in his bank career, William was working at the bank in Roebourne in northern Western Australia, and he was sleeping on the veranda and was murdered. It wasn't a robbery. money wasn't stolen from the bank, but papers were burnt. And fascinating, creepy kind of story. Nobody ever got charged. They don't know who done it. Fascinating story, detailed in a website if you're interested in the Roebourne bank murders. Google it. Fascinating. Poor old William Angkatell. Some people might know Angkatell Street. That's his grave. He and his dad's grave with a sign on it at Coburg Cemetery. And here's a picture of William himself. There's also on the website that I mentioned, I've got a couple of other pictures here about the Angkatell story. There's some fascinating images that were drawn and put into the newspapers at the time. And here's a couple of the newspaper headlines about the murders. It was quite a vicious murder. It was stabbings. Both he and the bank clerk at the time were killed in that goldfields land of northern West Australia at the time. And as I said, that was my last of the murder victims, so the shooting victims anyway. And I'm watching the clock and thinking I better get cracking. I've got, someone has written that they've seen the bullet holes at Trades Hall. Thanks, Adrienne. I think that if you are interested in more about that story, send us a message on in that messenger section there underneath this video, and I can send you some more information if you're curious. Someone asked where Squiz is buried. Yes, he's at Brighton, which is also, they've got a fantastic friends group at Brighton. They've put out some news papers and a book, and they do some great tours at Brighton Cemetery if you're ever interested. I wanted quickly just to talk about this fantastic gravestone that looks kind of like a tree, but isn't. It's concrete. And Lawrence Cohen, he was an amazingly powerful union boss of the stonemasons union, and he was, here's a link to segue from mining. He was at a miners' strike lobby activity trying to support miners in Broken Hill when he was on his way back from that activity, stopped overnight in Adelaide and died sadly by stepping out of his motel room out the window onto the balcony to have a smoke. No balcony. Down he went, unfortunately died. But he was an amazingly powerful, interesting, known, well-respected union boss, known politically, and his funeral is well reported. And our website, we have a story about that whole event, because we had a big event on the 100th anniversary of his death where the local MP came along and we put some flowers on Lawrence's grave. And speaking of politicians, this slightly conservative-looking family is John and Kate Curtin, John Curtin's parents. John Curtin, the MP from the war. Sorry, there's a note there. Bessie has said if he died in WA, he's actually buried there. Well, is he actually buried there? He was. Sorry, I think you're talking back about William Angkatell. William was buried at Roebourne, and a year after he was buried, his family disinterred him and brought him home on the train and buried him with his dad in at Coburg Cemetery. His dad was an important character in Coburg at the time. He was in the council, and anyway, sorry, I've moved on. Kate and John Curtin. Kate Curtin's an amazing person if you find out about her on one of our tours. She brought up John Curtin, the Prime Minister, who was a social reformer and an amazing Prime Minister during the Second World War. They had lived around Brunswick. They'd run pubs. They'd run pubs elsewhere as well. John Curtin Sr. had been a policeman for a while. He got sick. Kate looked after her sick husband. She looked after all of her children. She took in washing. She took in mending. She ran pubs. She worked in a bar, often in different places. They lived in something like 9 different rental properties around Brunswick. And years and years later, when John Curtin was the Prime Minister, John Curtin Jr. was Prime Minister, he said that he got his concept of social justice from his mother. And this was a Prime Minister who brought in social justice issues such as child endowment, and was very much influenced by Kate Curtin, who had taught him a lot about the real world, something that I think a lot of our politicians would benefit from. I was going to talk about the tossing Testros, who were acrobats, performers. They were actually Ruby and Ron Maloney, and Ruby was the daughter of Zinger Lee and what's his name, Cartwright, who was the murder victim at the Eastern Market at the turn of the last century. Fascinating, again, story on one of our newsletters. We've written about the tossing Testros, world-renowned acrobats, jugglers, balancers. But generally, when we run tours, like I said, we don't just talk about these amazing people. We talk about the angels and where the Casamento angel, that is just beautiful, where it came from, and how the Casamento family had pitched in and bought it from Italy, and also about the different symbolism and amazing stories of the people and their history in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. There are some beautiful monuments. There are gravestones, cultural symbols, really very ordinary, sometimes forgotten people who used to be loved. Some of them have some famous people who have streets named after them or train stations named after them. Really, the only way to find out about this stuff is to go there, wander around, follow our event, our map, and follow the brochure, or come on one of our tours. So keep an eye on our Facebook page, Friends of Coburg Cemetery. We've got a new website about to launch, but our old one's still there, friendsofcoburgcemetery.com, and or just email us. I'll put our email address for the group into the comment section of this video, and if people want to ask questions, you're very welcome to. There's a couple of comments there. Someone said, I don't remember there being signs about significant graves. We did that in 2011. In 2011, we worked with the General Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust, who are responsible for looking after the cemetery, to erect signage on 30 different graves around the place, and to put together that map that we store, and you should be able to pick up a copy in the rotunda when you get there, or if you just want to have a look at the list of names that's on our website. I think that's it for me. I thought I'd finish with a lovely picture of a lovely loving couple walking up into the sunshine at Coburg Cemetery that was taken not long ago. Thank you all for coming along. Are there any other questions while I'm still here? Susan has said, my great-grandmother's buried in Coburg Cemetery, died very young. So many children, so many young women buried there. There's obvious references around to tuberculosis and diphtheria that so many people have died from. You know, there's one of the signs that we put up was about a councillor, Coburg city councillor, who had lost 4 of his children within 2 weeks when an epidemic came through. I'm thinking that was diphtheria, but there was also tuberculosis. So many babies many unmarked graves. You walk around the cemetery, you think you're walking on an empty piece of land, but there's probably somebody buried, or maybe more than somebody. So yeah, thank you, Leanne. I'm looking forward to running tours again too. It's not just me. We're always open to more people who are interested in researching or presenting. We're very open to members. Like I said, we're a very small group. We haven't got a lot of money, but we can happily send information when people ask for it, and run tours when we're allowed to, and we can run. Like I said, we put out a newsletter that goes to members, and people who are friends on our Facebook page usually find out about that stuff as we go. Thank you very much for coming along, and I'll be answering questions on the comments page after this event. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you in the cemetery soon. Cheers.